On July 24, 1996, a normal summer afternoon in Bowling Green, Kentucky, suddenly turned into a nightmare. 7-year-old Morgan Violi was outside the Colony Apartments, playing near the wood line with her 6-year-old friend and other children. There was nothing about that afternoon that suggested something terrible was about to happen. Then a maroon Chevrolet van entered the apartment complex. According to the federal criminal complaint, the man driving the van got out and approached Morgan and her 6-year-old friend. He first attempted to grab the younger girl, but she managed to escape his grasp. Then he turned toward Morgan. Within moments, he grabbed the 7-year-old girl and forced her into the van. An adult witness saw what happened and immediately gave police a description of both the vehicle and the man. The suspect was described at the time as a white male in his 20s, with brown, shoulder-length hair, a thin build, and a tan complexion. The witness also remembered that the van's license plate contained the letters MN. Police had a description, they had witnesses, and they had a vehicle, but the van was already disappearing south. The investigation quickly became a desperate search for a missing child. Officers began working to determine where the stolen vehicle had gone and who was behind the abduction. What they did not know was that the van itself would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. 2 days later, investigators would find it abandoned in Tennessee. And inside that vehicle, they would unknowingly discover evidence that would remain silent for nearly 3 decades, until modern forensic science finally learned how to make it speak. The search for Morgan began immediately. Investigators knew the kidnapping had happened in broad daylight, and they had one crucial lead: the maroon Chevrolet van used by the abductor. The vehicle had not originally belonged to the kidnapper. According to federal prosecutors, it had been stolen in the Dayton, Ohio, area on July 23, 1996, just 1 day before Morgan disappeared. Investigators would later determine that the van was connected to the crime, making its movements one of the earliest threads in the investigation. 2 days after Morgan was abducted, the stolen van was discovered south of Nashville, Tennessee. Morgan was not inside. For her family, this was devastating. The vehicle had been recovered, but the child who had been taken from Bowling Green was still missing. Investigators immediately began examining the van for evidence. At the time, they could not have known that one tiny piece of biological evidence would remain important for decades. The investigation continued across state lines as authorities tried to determine who had stolen the vehicle, who had driven it to Kentucky, and what had happened to Morgan after she was taken. Meanwhile, Morgan's family and members of the community were desperate for answers. Days passed, then weeks, and eventually the search entered its most painful stage. Investigators had to consider that Morgan might never be found alive. Nearly 3 months after her disappearance, the case took a horrifying turn. On October 20th, 1996, human remains were discovered in a wooded area near White House, Tennessee. The remains were later identified as those of Morgan Violi. The search for the missing 7-year-old had finally ended, but the investigation into who had taken her and who had killed her was only beginning. And despite the vehicle, the witnesses, and the evidence collected in 1996, the person responsible would remain unidentified for nearly 30 years. The discovery of Morgan's body on October 20th, 1996, brought the search to a devastating end. For her family, there was no longer uncertainty about where Morgan was. But there was still one question that had no answer: who had taken her? By then, investigators had already recovered the maroon Chevrolet van used in the kidnapping. It had been found on July 26, 1996, at a truck stop in Williamson County, Tennessee, and investigators processed it for forensic evidence. At the time, however, forensic technology was nowhere near where it is today. Evidence could be collected, photographs could be taken, witnesses could be interviewed, but biological material recovered from an old crime scene could not always provide the answer investigators needed. And so Morgan's case entered the long, painful world of the cold case. Years passed, then decades. The investigators who had worked the original case eventually moved on or retired. New detectives inherited the file, but the central mystery remained unchanged. Who was the man in the van? And why had he chosen Morgan? There was another disturbing detail investigators would eventually uncover. The man responsible had not simply appeared out of nowhere. Before Morgan's disappearance, Robert Scott Froberg had already escaped custody in Alabama on April 3, 1996. After fleeing to Pennsylvania, he was arrested on May 20th after an incident involving a 7-year-old boy. He was then held in Northumberland County Jail. But on July 16, 1996, Froberg escaped again. Just 8 days later, Morgan disappeared. According to the federal case, investigators would later determine that Froberg traveled to Dayton, Ohio, stole the maroon Chevrolet van on July 23rd, and headed south. The pieces were there, but nobody could connect them. Not yet. For almost 30 years, Morgan's killer remained a mystery. Then investigators went back to the evidence collected from that abandoned van. And this time, the technology had finally caught up with the crime. For years, the investigation appeared to have reached a dead end. But one piece of evidence had never truly disappeared. When investigators processed the abandoned Chevrolet van in 1996, they collected hairs and other material from inside the vehicle. At the time, forensic technology could examine some of that evidence, but the tools available to investigators were nowhere near as powerful as the technology available decades later. In March 1997, FBI forensic testing confirmed that a fiber found in Morgan's hair was consistent with the material used in the seat cushion of the stolen van. That result connected Morgan directly to the vehicle, but it still did not reveal the identity of the person responsible. The evidence was preserved, and then it waited for almost 3 decades. As DNA technology advanced, investigators realized that some of the biological material recovered from the van could potentially be tested again using modern techniques. The FBI laboratory extracted a DNA profile from one of the hairs found inside the van. The profile was searched through CODIS, the national DNA database used by law enforcement. This time, there was a result. The DNA produced an association with Robert Scott Froberg. Suddenly, investigators had a name. But the name raised even more questions. Who was Robert Scott Froberg? And why would his DNA be inside the van connected to Morgan's disappearance? Investigators began digging into his past. They discovered that Froberg had a long criminal history and, even more remarkably, that he had escaped from custody twice in 1996. The second escape occurred on July 16, 1996, exactly 8 days before Morgan disappeared. The timeline was becoming impossible to ignore. Froberg had escaped. He had returned to Ohio. He had stolen a maroon Chevrolet van on July 23rd, and the following day, a 7-year-old girl vanished from Bowling Green. But DNA alone was not the end of the investigation. Detectives needed to understand what happened after the kidnapping, and they needed to know whether the man whose DNA had just surfaced after 30 years would finally tell them the truth. Once investigators connected the DNA evidence to Robert Scott Froberg, the cold case entered an entirely new phase. For almost 30 years, Morgan's family had lived without knowing who was responsible for taking their daughter. Now detectives had a name, and that name came with a disturbing history. Froberg had been in custody in Alabama earlier in 1996 after being arrested on charges that included kidnapping and other offenses. But he escaped from custody on April 3, 1996. He eventually made his way to Pennsylvania, where he was arrested again on May 20th. That should have been the end of his time on the run. It wasn't. On July 16, 1996, Froberg escaped from custody for a second time. 8 days later, Morgan disappeared. According to the federal investigation, Froberg then traveled to the Dayton, Ohio area. On July 23rd, he stole the maroon Chevrolet van that would become central to the Morgan Violi investigation. The next day, he was in Bowling Green, and a 7-year-old girl vanished. For investigators working the case decades later, the timeline was extraordinary. But they still needed more than a timeline. They needed to confront Froberg with the evidence. The investigation eventually led detectives to interview him in 2025. What followed was not a quick interrogation. It became a 9-hour interview involving Bowling Green Police Detective David Grimsley and an FBI special agent. For hours, investigators questioned Froberg about the events of 1996. They confronted him with the evidence. They asked him about the van. They asked him about Morgan. And eventually, according to prosecutors and investigators, Froberg admitted that he kidnapped and killed Morgan Violi. After nearly 30 years of uncertainty, investigators finally had something the original detectives could never obtain: a confession from the man they believed was responsible. But there was still one final question. Would that by 2025, investigators finally had what the original detectives had spent decades searching for: a suspect whose DNA had been linked to evidence from the van. But DNA was only part of the story. Investigators still needed to confront Robert Scott Froberg directly. That interview became one of the most important moments in the entire case. Detective David Grimsley of the Bowling Green Police Department, accompanied by an FBI special agent, spent approximately 9 hours interviewing Froberg. This was not a quick conversation. For hours, investigators went back through the events surrounding July 1996. They confronted Froberg with the evidence and questioned him about his movements after escaping custody, the stolen Chevrolet van, and the disappearance of 7-year-old Morgan Violi. Decades had passed since the crime, but the investigators were determined to reconstruct those missing hours. Eventually, according to the Bowling Green Police Department and federal prosecutors, Froberg confessed to kidnapping Morgan and killing her. After almost 30 years, the investigation had reached a remarkable turning point. The case no longer depended entirely on circumstantial evidence. The man investigators had linked to the crime through the preserved DNA evidence had now admitted his involvement. For Morgan's family, it was an answer they had waited decades to hear. But the confession did not immediately end the legal process. Federal prosecutors still had to build the case and bring the charges through the court system. In February 2026, federal authorities announced that Froberg had been charged with kidnapping resulting in death. The charge carried the possibility of life imprisonment. For a case that had begun in a Kentucky apartment complex in 1996, the investigation had now crossed 3 decades, multiple states, advances in forensic science, and an extraordinary interview. But the final chapter had not yet been written. Froberg still had to face the federal court. And the next development would finally reveal whether the man investigators said had taken Morgan's life would accept responsibility for what happened. After 30 years of waiting, the answer came in July 2026. On July 22, 2026, nearly 30 years after 7-year-old Morgan Violi disappeared from Bowling Green, Robert Scott Froberg finally stood before a federal judge and admitted responsibility. Froberg pleaded guilty to 1 federal count of kidnapping resulting in death. The plea brought the case to a point investigators had been working toward since that summer afternoon in 1996. For decades, Morgan's family had lived with unanswered questions. Who took her? What happened after the van left Kentucky? And would the person responsible ever be held accountable? Now they had an answer. Froberg admitted that he kidnapped Morgan on July 24, 1996, and that he was responsible for her death. According to the Justice Department, the investigation had ultimately connected him to the crime through evidence recovered from the stolen van and modern forensic testing. But there was an important distinction. Although Froberg had pleaded guilty and agreed to a life sentence, the judge had not yet formally imposed that sentence. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for November 2, 2026, at 10:30 a.m. in federal court in Bowling Green. If the court accepts the terms of the plea agreement, Froberg will receive life imprisonment. Because this is a federal case, there is no federal parole system that would allow him to simply become eligible for release after serving a portion of that sentence. For Morgan's community, the guilty plea represented something that had seemed impossible for years. The cold case was no longer simply a mystery. The person responsible had been identified. The evidence had survived. And the truth had finally emerged from a case that had remained unsolved for 3 decades. But there was still one final moment ahead. Before the judge could determine Froberg's sentence, Morgan's family would have an opportunity to face the man who had taken their daughter from them 30 years after the day she disappeared. The guilty plea on July 22, 2026, brought an extraordinary 30-year journey to its final legal chapter. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Robert Scott Froberg admitted in federal court that he kidnapped and murdered 7-year-old Morgan Violi on July 24, 1996. The plea was entered on a single federal count of kidnapping resulting in death. For investigators, the case had come full circle. In 1996, Morgan had disappeared in a matter of moments. The stolen van was recovered. Evidence was collected. Her remains were eventually found in Tennessee. But the person responsible remained unidentified for decades. Then old evidence was examined with modern forensic technology. The investigation connected Froberg to the crime, and authorities later confronted him with the evidence. According to prosecutors, he confessed to driving Morgan into Tennessee, where he strangled her, causing her death, before leaving her body near a barn and fleeing the area. That confession transformed a decades-old mystery into a case with an identified perpetrator and a guilty plea. But even after the courtroom admission, the case still had one procedural step remaining: sentencing. Froberg agreed to a life sentence under the plea agreement. However, the court had not yet formally imposed that sentence. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for November 2, 2026, at 10:30 a.m. in federal court in Bowling Green. If the court accepts the agreement, he will receive life imprisonment. For Morgan's family, the passage of time could never undo what happened. But after 3 decades of unanswered questions, they finally knew who was responsible. And there was something else the guilty plea accomplished. It transformed Morgan's story from an unsolved kidnapping and murder into a case with a documented conclusion. The little girl who disappeared in Kentucky in 1996 had finally received justice, but the story still had one final scene: the courtroom where Morgan's family would face the man responsible, and where a judge would determine his final punishment. For Morgan Violi's family, the guilty plea was more than the conclusion of a criminal investigation. It was the end of a wait that had lasted almost 30 years. On July 24, 1996, Morgan had disappeared in seconds. Her family had spent years living with the unanswered questions that follow a child abduction case: where she was taken, what happened to her, and whether the person responsible would ever be identified. For investigators, the case became a lesson in patience and persistence. The original evidence had never stopped matching. The stolen Chevrolet van had been recovered. Evidence from that vehicle had been preserved. Morgan's remains had been recovered months after her disappearance. And decades later, advances in forensic science allowed investigators to return to evidence that had once failed to provide an answer. That evidence helped lead authorities to Robert Scott Froberg. The investigation then moved from the laboratory to the interrogation room, where detectives spent approximately 9 hours questioning him. According to authorities, Froberg eventually confessed. Then came the courtroom. On July 22, 2026, he pleaded guilty to kidnapping resulting in death. For the investigators who had worked on the case across generations, it was an extraordinary conclusion to a case that had remained unresolved for so long. But perhaps the most important part of the story is Morgan herself. For years, her name was associated with a disappearance that had no clear ending. Now the official record tells a different story. Morgan Violi was 7 years old when she was kidnapped. Her remains were found in Tennessee 3 months later. The investigation remained unsolved for decades. Modern forensic work eventually identified the man responsible. And in 2026, that man admitted his guilt in federal court. The final sentencing was still ahead. But one thing could no longer be taken away from Morgan's family. They finally knew who was responsible for the loss of their little girl. For nearly 3 decades, Morgan Violi's case remained one of those investigations that seemed destined to become another forgotten cold case. But it never truly disappeared. The evidence remained. The memories remained. And most importantly, Morgan's family never stopped waiting for answers. The events began on July 24, 1996, when 7-year-old Morgan was abducted from the Colony Apartments in Bowling Green, Kentucky. A stolen maroon Chevrolet van became a crucial part of the investigation. 2 days later, the vehicle was recovered in Tennessee. Then, on October 20, 1996, Morgan's remains were discovered in a wooded area near White House, Tennessee. For years, investigators had no suspect they could bring to justice. Then science changed what was possible. Modern forensic analysis of evidence preserved from the van helped investigators connect Robert Scott Froberg to the case. Detectives later confronted him during a 9-hour interview, and authorities say he confessed to kidnapping and killing Morgan. In February 2026, federal prosecutors announced charges against him. And on July 22, 2026, nearly 30 years after Morgan disappeared, Froberg pleaded guilty to kidnapping resulting in death. Under the plea agreement, he agreed to a life sentence, although the court had not yet formally imposed that sentence. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for November 2, 2026. Morgan's story therefore ends not with another unanswered question, but with accountability finally within reach. A little girl disappeared in 1996. Her family waited. Investigators kept the case alive. Evidence survived 3 decades, and eventually modern science helped reveal the person behind the crime. 30 years later, Morgan finally had something her family had been waiting for since that terrible afternoon. An answer. Her life ended far too soon, but her story did not. And the case became another reminder that sometimes, no matter how much time passes, the evidence is still waiting to tell the truth.